Hello, everyone. Okay, this is the last video for this module. It's been a lot of information, but it really sets the tone for understanding the foundation of assessment. So in the first video, we had a very broad overview of assessment, what it is. In the second video, I talked a little bit about the technical aspects of tests so that we can understand how they are created. A lot of times we interpret tests in a way that they were never meant to be interpreted. And so as we use those assessment tools and we gather information to answer those questions, we need to understand the tools. So today, I just want to talk a little bit about administering tests. As said in the previous video, as a special education person, you are considered a trained person to be able to administer tests. So just a little information on that. Should you have to administer a test? Those of you who have been administering the Wyatt, the Key Math, the NEPC, the Woodcock-Johnson, Reading Mastery, Woodcock-Johnson, Reading Mastery. These are all tests that special educators tend to give to students, as well as school psychologists. And for those who are new, just a couple of things to keep in mind when administering these types of tests. Good. So how do I prepare? And so in this course, as I mentioned, we typically in class actually practice the test. So one thing I would like to mention is that there are a number of tests, formal assessments, the Woodcock, Johnson, the Wyatt, the Key Math, I believe the Tactile, the Gray Oral Reading Battery, which is older test, the TOWEL, which is a very in-depth writing assessment that we don't use as much because it takes a very long time. All of these materials are in the library under this course. Should you ever want to pick up one of these tools and take a look at it and go through it, please do. So all of those materials are there for you to sort of play with, to go through, to take a look at. I will launch the list of items in Canvas. I will open that up so you can see all the things that are available. And if you, this semester or maybe even next semester, whenever you get a chance, they're always there for students to take a look at and to peruse. The Wyatt being very, very popular, something that you should take a look at. And basically, most of these start off the same. You look at where you either look at the birth date, the grade of the student. There's always an indicator for a starting point, which is your basal. So you start with your basal, and that's the question you begin with. So everyone doesn't start on question 1. Most times you have your easel book, and you will look for the student's age, grade, or what other indicator might be there, where to start. And then as you start, the student has to get a certain number of questions correct in a row. Then you know you're in the right place. So once the student gets those correct, you keep going till you hit something called a ceiling. That is when the student is starting to answer the questions incorrectly. When you hit a ceiling, and I believe for the Wyatt, it's 5 questions in a row, that is when you discontinue asking questions in that section. So when I start off with a test, I always explain to students that I'm going to give you a test, and this test was designed for people who are from kindergarten all the way up to 100 years old. It's not 100, but I say that 100 years old. So there is, I think it's like some of the tests say like 85 or a high number. So you're not supposed to know everything that's on this test. There's some things that will be easy and some things that will be hard. And so just do your best, and we're going to work on this together. And so really, those are sort of the things that I start off with. And in preparing, there's a lot of things you have to know. Familiarizing yourself with the test. So let's dig into it a little bit. So become familiar with the test, and become familiar with one test. And when you've done one test of this nature, all of them are very, very similar. If you're in a school where you will never have to give any of these tests, it's important to still become familiar. If you're not interested in looking at the test, I have videos of the test and sections so that all tests are not created equally. If a test says that it is measuring reading, you might have 3 reading tests that measure reading differently. And so you as a teacher, you're receiving this IEP and this assessment information. And so when it comes to the classroom and you're looking at it, if you kind of know what was on that test and you can see where the student didn't do well, you start to understand, oh, this is the domains of where the student is having difficulty. So it's always a good thing to sort of familiarize with the test. The environment, testing, these types of tests are one-on-one and should be done in a distraction-free, quiet location. It is very, very unprofessional and unfortunate that I have been in several schools where classroom teachers had to give these tests in the classroom while an aide is working with other students. And that's not always optimal, but it does happen. So you establish a rapport with the student if it's your student, if you're doing annual reviews. So some special education teachers, some places used to do heavy testing annual reviews and then they discontinued that. So if it's a triennial and you're doing it, or if you've just been asked to test because the school psychologist is overwhelmed, or you're hired as an evaluator, if you don't know the student, it's always important to establish a rapport, which is really basic courtesy. So how will things go? So introduce yourself, speak to the student, ask them to tell you a little bit about who they are. Establishing a rapport is so important. It's so important that on the very newest and latest performance test in special education, there's a whole section on evaluating candidates on establishing a rapport by video, and they actually grade students on that because it is so important. I'm explaining what we will do today. We're taking a test and we're just getting some information, a description of some of the things that they may be doing, and encouraging them. You're going to do fine. This is going to be fine, and really giving them some basic encouragement. So there's something called a protocol, and a protocol is the actual sheet that you have. So there is the easel that you're going to see an example of that, where that has the questions that you will look at and you will ask the student. But there's also the protocol in which the administrator has that they use to grade the students' responses. And so you'll have that. And in each section, there's always a demonstration item so that the student has a chance to practice. So if you say, please point to the animal that has 4 legs, and the student does that, that is a demonstration item for then the next items, which may be counting the number of things related to a larger object. So there would be a demonstration item, and the demonstration item would be very clear, very exact, very precise to all of the questions that follow it. explained the basal, your entry point, and the ceiling is the point in which you just continue asking questions. And when you get to that point, you can say, okay, so that was really good. Thank you for your participation. Now we're going to go on to the next section. Most of these tests have multiple subtests, as you will see, and we will continue to discuss. So test behaviors, and this is twofold. One, if you are administering a test, but even more important, if it is available to you, if you have a student and you're trying to understand what's going on, and there's a file, and there was the actual protocol with the information on it, and someone actually wrote down some testing behaviors. These are all good. It's all good information, and it's information that is part of the assessment that we gather. Remember to make those decisions. So we learn a lot about that. So it is important to note and record a student's behavior because it may provide valuable information about the student's needs. So their activity level, how they are during the test, their attention to tasks. In a testing situation one-on-one, if a student has no attention, cannot attend to a test, that is very informing. Their level of perseverance, which gives you a sense of how a student works through problems. Do they have strategies? Do they try different things? Are they processing? So some of these things you can kind of see in their behavior. Do they need a lot of reassurance? Do they need a lot of encouragement? Do they need a lot of prompting? Do they need a lot of direction? And so some of the things that you might want to think about asking yourself is, did the student show consistent test behaviors? What types of behaviors were exhibited during tests or subtests that assess the student's strengths? That is the areas in which the students earn the highest scores. So when a student is, say, doing a reading section, which is an area of strength, what type of behaviors were exhibited versus when they had to do a math section on an achievement test? Did the behavior change? Did their interests change? Did their risk behavior change? Basic things that we would commonly look for even in a classroom setting, but we're being more keenly aware of it in this situation because we're trying to answer those very important questions and we're trying to make decisions. What type of behaviors were exhibited during tests or subtests that assess the student's weak area? And was the student's test behavior representative of usual classroom behavior or behavior at home? And sometimes in a testing situation, you can see a completely different set of behaviors than in the classroom or at home. So sometimes we do see a completely different side of a student, and all of that we need to sit and talk about instead of just the numbers, because it helps us understand. So this is just a very short example, one of the many examples of how testing behaviors was very helpful while I was testing a young man named Michael. And while I was testing him on the Wyatt, the first 3 items he answered incorrectly. So I did the whole setup. I had the easel in front of me. We did the demonstration item. He got that right. And then when I did the first 3 questions, he didn't answer them correctly. But I noticed that he was paying attention to me. So staring at my mouth, I mean, so intently. And so I asked him, I said, Michael, do you want me to read the item slower? And so then he said, yes. And then after that, he started getting all of the questions correct. And I had worked with Michael. So it wasn't an issue of not having a rapport, or he was nervous, it was the first time that I realized the behavior of him staring at my mouth. And I've had many students do that, seeming like they're they're new to English, like they're English language learners, but actually it is a characteristic of students who have auditory processing problems, where they're looking at your mouth because they're getting cues from your mouth because they're not perceiving things. And so they're like very visually, they're leaning on their visual skills to help them process their auditory skills. And so at the end of the testing, one of the things that I noticed was when I slowed down my speech pattern, Michael did so much better. And it was something that we did not even think about. And so even though I was not there to test him for speech, and we didn't have that on his individual, it was on his plan, but but all of the effort was, it's an academic problem. It's an academic problem. So we did the achievement part first, and then we realized that there was something else going on, and followed up, of course, with the speech testing, and he speech impaired. There was a lot going on there with speech. And in the classroom, with all of the moving around and teachers giving 5 examples, go to the back of the room, get your coat, then get online, be quiet. We're going down to the lunchroom. When we get to the lunchroom, make sure you have your lunch card and get on the line and da 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 da. And so with all that going on, he just got lost in the sauce. The multiple directions given in class in academic subjects. So that happens. I had another student named Tahira who that happened. It caused a lot of social problems. She had auditory processing problems. And she also was a student who would look very intently and lean on other modalities to help her with her weakness. And socially, she would fill in the blanks. So if the teacher said, go to the back of the room, get your coat, get online, you're going to go outside for recess. Or one time I observed her going to the back, and then when she got to the back of the room, she didn't know what she was supposed to do. So she asked another student, what are we doing? Which was for the other student, it's 2nd grade. The other student didn't understand the question, thought it was kind of odd, like, what are you asking? What are we doing? We get it in coats. And so, of course, at 7-year-old, the student didn't know to do that. So the student ignored her because she thought it was a dumb question. And they were supposed to be doing this task, not in complete silence, but they were supposed to keep their voices down. So the other student told her, you need to quiet down, you need to be quiet. And then Tahira fills in the blanks. She's bullying me. She's telling me to be quiet. I don't like how she's talking to me. And so Tahira constantly had social issues in 7th grade. I mean, in 2nd grade, there was always a problem. And unfortunately, the kids in her class were labeling her as a liar. And no one liked her. And they didn't want to talk to her. She's a liar. She lies about everything. But she actually was filling in the blanks a lot. And so through assessment, we realized the speech issues. We developed some new strategies, informing the child of some of this, because this became behavior that she was compensating for a need that she couldn't articulate, that I don't understand everything that's being said. And so in observing her, she would take cues from what other people were doing and try to figure it out, because she was a very bright child with an auditory processing problem, and she was just trying to survive and figure things out. And so her compensation, in compensating, there were behaviors that really made her look like she was a behavior problem. Had she been somewhere else, they would have said she was a compulsive liar with emotional behavioral problems. And it was none of that. It was a speech language problem. And the fact that we were able to find it and go through the process. Again, another success story. Tahira was able to do very well once we got the right intervention. So this stuff really does work. So when we score tests, we have to know the age of the students. I just wanted to mention this because scoring tests is one of the most important things. A lot of it is done by computer. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because a lot of it is done by computer. A lot of schools use things like the NWEA instead of, well, the NWEA is not the same as individualized testing, but you do get some of the information from that if we don't do one-to-one. One-to-one test also has capabilities of having the students doing it online and scoring it. Definitely the BASC is one of those that you can just go online or go into an iPad and put in certain answers. So if you ever had to do it by hand, it's just important if you do it by hand or if you do it by computer. If you ask for the student's age, that type of information is very important because that is where the norms are selected. And we're going to talk more about norms and how important that is to, of course, normed test. So when a student is taking a one-to-one a test with an assessment tool that is normed reference, there are a choice of scores that can be reported. So in sessions past, we talked a little bit about it. When you as the test administrator are writing on the protocol, you are recording students' responses in a raw score. So the raw score is if the student got it right or got it wrong. If there's 10 items and the student got 5 correct, the raw score would be 5. We don't report raw scores on normed tests. Raw scores are then transformed into derived scores. And this is a review because we talked about this in the last video. So we have derived scores. And so from these derived scores, we have a whole bunch that we can use. So we have age and grade equivalence. And age and grade equivalence, and I know I said this in the last video, I'm going to say it again because it's one of the most important things that I see mistakes. Grade equivalence. So we have raw scores, and then we take the raw score, and then they are made into a derived score called an age and grade equivalent. It looks at the number of correct responses, and then the average of those responses correlates with a grade or an age, depending upon which one you're asking. So for example, if Omari earned a raw score, a 2.5, so I'm testing him on the Wyatt, he answers, I have a number, his raw score, let's say, is 25. And so 25, I'll put that 25, either hand score it or put it in the computer. And for, let's say, a reading vocabulary, for his vocabulary score comes out to a grade equivalent of 2.5. It doesn't mean that Omari understands vocabulary at the 2nd grade, 5th month. Doesn't mean that at all. What it means is that Omari earned a raw score roughly equivalent to that of, this should be 2.5, of second grade, 5th month students in the norm group, if there were second grade, 5th grade students. Because as I mentioned before, sometimes that particular part of the norm sample is not there, so it becomes an extrapolation. So Omari's raw score is equivalent to the average of the statistical second grade, 5th month. I'm so sorry that this slide says 7th grade. It should not. It should say second grade, 5th month, right? So when we get a grade equivalent or age equivalent, it does not describe the student's current instructional level. I see it all the time. That's not what it means. So if we give the key math and it says on the key math that the student is at a 3.5 age equivalent, I'm sorry, 3.5 grade equivalent, and the student is in 6th grade, the teacher will say he's 3 years behind in math. That is not what that means. It means that the student answered on average the same number of responses as the norm group of students who were in that rough area, that were roughly in 3rd grade, 2nd, 3rd grade, because there's some extrapolation, because when you have a norm group, there is not representative of every single month. They do not take people and say, okay, you're 3rd grade 1 month, 3rd grade 2 months, 3rd grade 3 months. It's not. So it's broad strokes, and then in the middle, we use statistics to come up with those in-between scores. That's what it means. So in order not to confuse you, the most important part of what I'm trying to express in saying is that age equivalents and grade equivalents do not correlate with instructional level. If you have an 8th grader and we do this testing, this type of testing, these tests, and the student comes out on a 1st grade level, don't give them 1st grade books. It doesn't mean that they read 1st grade, they read on 1st grade level. That is not what that means. That's not their instructional level. It doesn't. What does it mean? It means that they answered only enough questions correctly as the norm group. Now, here's something that's very interesting. If there are 20 questions and a student answers 5 questions correctly, you got 2 completely different situations. Remember basal and ceiling? So I can have a student answer 1 question right, 4 questions wrong. 1 question right, 4 questions wrong. 1 question right, 4 questions wrong. So this student will answer 5 questions and get all the way to the more sophisticated questions, but they've gotten a lot wrong, but they didn't hit the ceiling. So now the student has 5 right, but they might be on item 20 something, whereas another student who answered 5 right got the first 5 right, which is still not sophisticated, and then got the next 5 wrong and hit the ceiling. So you have 2 students who both have a raw score of 5, but their performance on the test is completely different. And so their instructional levels would be completely different. And there has never, ever, ever been any advice from the test makers or the educational psychology community to say, please use these types of tests for instructional level. They were never intended to do that. But in practice, we see a lot of that happening, and that's not a good use of it because it's not precise, it's not accurate at all. But what should we use? What should we do? So what we should use are standard scores. They give us give us more useful information, because remember, the question is not, can the student read on grade level? The question is, how atypical is the student's reading behavior to the point that it falls outside the realms that there is a reading disability? That's the question. The question is not about grade level. It's not for these tests. It's about how far from the norm is the performance of this individual to the fact that it would put them in what we would call, yes, they're so far out of the norm that there is a handicapping disability. And so that's how we use assessment to kind of understand that. When you look up the 13 categories and all those characteristics, emotionally behavior disorder, I could be that. I'm not that every day. I could be that on a morning when I don't drink coffee and I had a bad day. Every last thing that's there, I disassociative, oppositionally defiant, all of them, but not every day. So if I took a test on that, or if someone, an informant filled out a BASC for me, it would not come out, I would not come out high on that. So it's to the degree, right? Remember in the beginning, to the extent, to the degree. How far from the norm is the performance? So standard scores are comparative. We can compare subtests, and we look at students' performance to understand if they hit the average limits. So I'm going to stop share and I'm going to go to the next tab, and then I'm just going to explain what I mean by that. So I'm going to stop share, and oh, wait a minute. Okay, I'm going to share again, and I like this particular, what is this? Okay, got it. Okay, I really like this, and there is a textbook, the reading that is on Canvas. There is a picture. It's not as nice as this, and so this is what helps us. So most tests will give you this information in this way, and so we want to look for this information. When they give parents the information, they give it to them this way so that we can understand a little bit and we can interpret a little better, and we can really understand what we're saying. So the question is not about grade level. The question is about, we use this to look for how atypical. So if the standard score for a reading assessment in the subtests, so in the subtest, I can get grade equivalence, age equivalence, and standard scores across the subtest. So let's say in the WIAT, there's expressive writing, vocabulary, spelling, phonemic awareness, all of these different parts. I can get the derived score of a standard score. And so if the standard score is consistently 85, 89, 90, 100, then I know that that student is in the average range, and the average range for the norm group, and in the average range in general performance. So I kind of know the student is here, right? So if the student has scores 102, 5, 6, 10, we're still in the average range, and we're here. One of the things in my experience, this is just experience, is that we have some students who are 80 to 85, and so it's slightly below average, and they're consistent. The intelligence quotient is 85. Their achievement scores are 85. Everything comes up like 80, 85, and it's just a little bit below. And those students are students who need help, but their profile, they don't have an intellectual disability, and characteristically, a lot of things show that they don't have a learning disability. And sometimes these kids do get lumped in as having a learning disability, and they don't. They're students who are going to struggle with academic material, because these types of tests kind of are correlated with school school tasks in academics. So it doesn't mean, it means the student is a little bit below average and they might have some challenges, but it doesn't mean that they're cognitively impaired. And it doesn't mean that it's learning disability. There might be a struggle, a good struggle. So we'll know if they're below average. If we see some districts use, I think 75 as a cutoff, here on this 70, some places 65. So in this area, we're looking to see how a student performs. And so if they're in this area, it's a significantly below average, extremely below average. So we're looking to see how far out of average the student is performing on an academic task, a behavioral task, whatever it is that we're measuring, because we measure behavioral tasks as well as academics, as well as adaptability and intelligence. And so we're looking to see how far. We have some students who will perform above average and significantly, and they're over here. And so we have some students over here. We have special under the umbrella of special education, and over here they would be known as gifted students. And so these students would have IQs that are above 130. We do have some gifted and talented programs where students have IQs that are like 120 and above. I'm starting at 120. And so over here, you have students who, who are above, extremely above, and have a different handle on academic tasks, a different level of proficiency of handling academic material. So this is using standard scores, I think, help us understand the testing as it relates to assessment for special education, and answering those questions. And when you receive a psychological, and you're reading it, as soon as you see the standard scores, you'll already be able to tell, without even reading the rest of it, where the areas of weakness are and where the areas of strength. And you can zone right into, okay, this is the broad area, and then you can delve a little bit more. So knowing this information is very useful if you're giving tests, if you're reading a report, if you're a parent and a parent receives this. And so you can, and they say, can you explain it? You can. And it gives us an idea of where is a child. If the child's name is Waldo, where is Waldo on this? Where is a child? How atypical from the average is the child? That's the question. Not can the child necessarily, how the child is doing in the class, how the child is, can the child read on grade level? Can they do math on grade level? That's not the question that these types of tests were designed to answer. They were designed to answer and consider how atypical, how outside of the norm is the performance. So thank you for spending this time with me on this particular tab in this module. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please email me. Have a great day.